Hi. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Katie Berry, Executive Director of Keep Bermuda Beautiful, and today I'm joined by my colleague, Erich Hetzel, local environmentalist. Erich and I lead the Beyond Plastic campaign, a collaboration of KBB, BEST, and Green Rock, which is a growing team of dedicated volunteers. Beyond Plastic's goal is primarily to provide education and information regarding single-use plastic. It is also our hope to be able to provide the support the community needs to make the changes necessary for success. It is indisputable that the world needs less single-use plastic. The question becomes, how do we do this in Bermuda? How do we create a model that embraces sustainability but takes into account our unique circumstances? What works somewhere else may or may not work here. I do not underestimate the depth and the complexity of the issues that need to be considered. The way we do things needs to be transformed, not only for the benefit of the environment, but also our health and for Bermuda's future. The government cannot do this alone. We need every individual, organization, business to get on board. It is all hands on deck to figure this out together. Beyond Plastic welcomes the opportunity to figure this out together. I now invite you to take a poll. These polls help us understand what we need to do and what our audiences know. Thank you for participating. Thank you. So I'm now going to hand over to Erich, part of the Beyond Plastic campaign and local environmentalist. Erich has a master's in marine and estuarine environmental science and heads up Best Plastics campaign. He is possibly the person that knows the most about plastic in Bermuda, and I'm lucky enough to work closely with him and be inspired every day about the possibilities that a reduction in single-use plastic offers Bermuda. If you have any questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A tab, which you should see if you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen. I look forward to answering your questions at the end of the presentation.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. We're going to tell you a little story about the problem with plastics and about why we believe that we need to reduce our dependence on especially single-use plastics. So if I can just begin. So these are two harmless looking little plastic cups with frosty drinks in them. You know, what could be wrong with them? They look so benign and so happy, you know, on a beach scene with plastic straws. So what's wrong with this picture, I guess, is the question. So plastic, unfortunately, those cups and those straws and everything else that's made of plastic, unfortunately, impacts us in several ways, four main ways. The first is the environment, represented by this picture. The second is climate change, which you could consider a environmental impact as well, but it's big enough to be considered on its own. The third issue is environmental justice, and that may be something that a new term that you haven't heard about. It's similar to social justice. It's the same type of concept. And I'm going to explain all these as I go through tonight. And the last one is human health. So plastics impacts us a lot more than just litter on the beach, you know, which is an environmental issue. It impacts us a lot of different ways. And these have economic impacts as well, which is really important. So I'm not going to bombard you with statistics, but I'm going to share just a few. So the first thing to do is to remember that really we had very little plastic prior to 1950. So plastic was only invented in the late 40s, only started in production in the 50s, and it really only became prevalent in really the 70s. So now the global annual production of plastic is about 330 million metric tons. So that's a big number. You don't have to focus on it. If you want to think about an analogy for it, it's equivalent to the weight of the human population. which is obviously huge. About half of that plastic is single use. So it lasts in your hands, in my hands, or who's ever using it. It lasts usually about 15 minutes, and then it gets tossed away. About 60 to 99 million metric tons becomes mismanaged plastic waste. So that means it winds up either in open landfills. Well, mainly that's what becomes of it. Gets discarded in open landfills. So, out of that, we dump about 8 million tons of plastic into the ocean. So that's equivalent to about a garbage truckload a minute gets dumped into the ocean. And because of that, by 2050, it's estimated that there'll be more plastic in the ocean than fish. So more plastic in the ocean than fish by 2050. And also by 2050, plastics processing and manufacturing should account for as much as 20% of petroleum consumed globally and 15% of the annual carbon budget. So plastic is also part of the carbon problem with global warming. So that's the importance of this. These plastic and global warming are, intertwined, because what's happening is as fuel use goes down, the petrochemical companies are ramping up their plastic production to make up for the deficit in revenues. Consumer packaging accounts for 42% of plastic production. So a lot of it's just packaging. And plastic production is set to double within the next 20 years. So if we think it's bad today, just stand by. By the time your children grow up, it'll be twice as bad. So we need to do something today. It's not a problem that we can just ignore. It's not a can that we can kick down the proverbial road. We need to deal with this, unfortunately. And remember that plastic doesn't go away. So most of the plastic that was ever produced, more than 90% of it, still exists today. So, and what's the problem? Well, the problem is that plastic was seen as a great invention. It was, very inexpensive, easy to make. It was very durable. And that same durability has proven to be our downfall because it doesn't go away. And we have started using more and more and more plastic every year, and it's set to continue if we don't stop. So we are the problem, we the people that use plastic, and we don't even realize how ubiquitous it's become. It's everywhere. It's in everything. And we tried to do a year living without plastic, and I can tell you it's very difficult because just about everything comes packaged in plastic. So we need to cut down our plastic, because what happens to the plastic is it just winds up here. It winds up in the garbage can. So 50% of it single use. Within 15 minutes, it just winds up in the trash. And this is your typical beauty and trash can. It's full of water bottles and plastic bags and a face mask and a plastic cup. It's all plastic, So this is where it winds up. And a portion of it winds up here also. So again, some of it, they call it leakage. And a lot of that plastic, rather than winding up in our incinerator, winds up on the roadside. And when it winds up in the roadside, it blows into the hedges. It winds up in farm fields. We become exposed to it in those environments. And a certain percentage of it winds up also in the ocean. So we are part of the problem with the ocean plastic. And when it winds up in the environment, you've all seen this, obviously, that it breaks up into big pieces, shown on the left, called macroplastics. It breaks further down in little tiny pieces called microplastics. But it also breaks down even further into something called nanoplastics, which are small enough to be actually absorbed into your skin. But The other thing about nanoplastics is they're actually contained in certain compounds. So you'll find them in facial scrubs, cosmetics, cleaners, skincare products actually have plastics in them. And that's a problem because they can be absorbed directly into your skin. Now, do we really need all this plastic? Well, I just want to, again, throw just a couple more numbers at you. This is the waste generation per capita of plastic every year. So in the United States, it runs somewhere between 130 and 105 kilograms per person per year. Big number. In Bermuda, the number is actually a little bit larger potentially. But I just want to point out that in the EU, you can look at the EU as a total, or Italy as an example, they use about half. They produce about half the amount of waste. So why is that? Somebody asked me that, and I still don't have a clear answer for it. There's probably lots of different reasons, but the EU lives a pretty good lifestyle. They're a very affluent set of nations. So obviously it's not purely affluence or this has to do with lifestyle and cultural habits that we have. So can we change? I think that certainly we could probably reduce our plastic use tremendously and still live a similar lifestyle. We're not going to have to give up. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be an adjustment, but I think that we can do it. So now if we go to the places that's affecting us, I'm not going to doom scope you here with environmental pictures. I think that you're all pretty familiar with pictures of plastic damage in the environment. I'm just going to show you a few. So this is a bird that's eaten plastic and died. We've heard the problem about turtles and fish eating plastic. You may have seen the video of the turtle with the plastic straw up its nose. That was quite impactful. And obviously you've seen the beach litter. So plastic definitely impacts the environment. And you're aware of this. So I know that probably everybody's aware of this. In fact, and one person that we spoke to this week said, you can really just stop your talk. You don't have to say anything more because people get it. Everybody understands that plastic is a problem in the environment. Well, that's true, but it's still only part of the problem. And I think that it's important that we understand that it's only part of the problem. So let's talk about the other places that plastic doesn't impact our lives. So as we know, the plastic starts as trash, and sometimes that trash, a certain percentage of it becomes litter. Somebody's got to clean up that litter. Somebody's got to pick up the trash. Some of that litter winds up in the ocean. That affects the environment. It affects the fisheries production. It affects the beaches. It affects tourism. And some of it, eventually, we consume it. A certain percentage of that winds up in our own bodies, and that affects our human health. I'm going to come back to that especially. The important thing to know is that at every step along the way, that costs you money. So while you may not see it at the cash register, that plastic bottle that you bought is actually costing you more than you're actually seeing, because there's a lot of these, what you might call hidden costs associated with plastic. So the World Wildlife Fund has estimated that the true cost of plastic is actually 10 times the first cost of plastic. And they estimate that the societal cost of plastic produced in this year, or 2019, would be $3.7 trillion over the estimated lifetime of that plastic. And by 2040, that's set to go up to 7.1 trillion. So those are just unimaginable numbers. I understand that. That's equivalent, they say, to 85% of global spending on healthcare in 2018. So those are huge, huge numbers. So the true cost of that plastic is not being paid. It's just sitting there. We're all having to pay it on the back end. So where do these costs come from? They come from greenhouse gas costs. They come from increased healthcare costs. They come from waste management, and they come from mismanaged waste. So that's plastic that winds up in in the ocean or in open landfills. And that's, again, equivalent to 10 times the cost of the first cost of that plastic. This slide here just shows you, and I just put it in here just to emphasize that the costs that they've estimated don't actually include some of the probably the biggest costs, which are the health impact costs. And some of the environmental costs are not included in that those numbers, that $3.7 trillion. Because right now the healthcare costs are just very difficult to estimate. They will in time. So expect that number to actually increase in time, not decrease, because healthcare costs are probably huge. It's just very hard. So it's important to realize that the plastics manufacturers, what they're doing is they're trying to pass those costs on to you because they'd like you to pay them rather than them pay them. So rather than pay the true cost of the product, you're paying a reduced cost and paying these costs on the back end. So you pay to pick up the trash, you pay to pick up the litter, and Katie's going to have to remind me how many tons of litter got picked up just in Bermuda alone. There's increased healthcare costs associated with plastic. There's environmental costs. Again, back to the, if people don't come to the beach because of plastic, if fisheries decrease because of plastic, those are costs that have to be borne. And then there's the cost of climate change. You've heard a lot about climate change. Climate change costs are going to be huge. The sea level rise is going to impact, obviously, millions and millions of people. And that's associated with plastic. Now, it's also important to know that if you live near the point of extraction or refinement or production or disposal of plastic, you're paying more costs because it's impacting you even more. And I'm going to come to this in the next couple of slides as well. There is a way to try to recoup these costs. It's called extended producer responsibility. This is becoming more topical these days to try to get the manufacturers to actually pay the costs of cleaning up the mess that they've kind of produced and left us with. So extended producer responsibility is one way to try to get the manufacturers to pay, if it's even feasible to pay enough. So there are certain jurisdictions that are putting this into practice. Now, if I could just talk about environmental justice, this may be a term you're not familiar with. This is very similar to social justice. This is if you live near the point of extraction, as I said. So if you live in Louisiana, it's called Cancer Alley for a reason, then you're paying a higher cost. You're living with increased pollution. You're living with increased exposure. It's affecting your lifestyle. It's probably affecting your health. You're paying a price. If you live near production, same thing. The marginalized communities in the world, poorer communities of the world actually use more plastic. More plastic is actually shipped to them. They're exposed to more plastic. Also because, I'll come back to it again with recycling. Recycling actually bundled up plastic and just shipped it to Asia and now Africa. So they're getting more exposed through waste disposal, but also through use. So just to talk about a couple of types of plastic, you've probably seen these recycling codes. It's not really important to know all the different kinds of plastic, but it's important to know that there's probably no really safe plastic. All plastic has some kind of compounds in it that are concerned to you for health reasons. They're concerned in the environment for animal health and environmental health reasons. So there are better ones and worse plastics, but there's no really truly safe plastic. And one of the key ones is actually one called PET, which is what's your water bottles are made of. So your PET bottles are that's a type of plastic called PET, and those PET bottles, if you take them and crush them up especially, then you're being exposed to microplastics and nanoplastics, and you're drinking those. It's estimated that mostly through water that people are getting about 5 grams of plastic a week. So that's about a credit card's worth of plastic a week. In addition to that, you're also getting chemicals that leach out of that plastic. So those chemicals and that plastic is affecting your health. So how do plastics affect your health? They affect neurological problems. They're implicated in those problems. They're implicated in cancers, birth defects, skin rashes, hormonal changes, gastric ulcers, respiratory issues, thyroid problems, cardiovascular disease, and infertility. And after that, I kind of ran out of space, but also on there really should be diabetes and autism. They're also suspected of being affected by plastic. These are huge, huge issues, and we have a huge issue in Bermuda with a lot of these issues. How much is being caused by plastic? It's hard to know. I'll come back to that in a second, but we're being impacted by it. I mean, we could try to make believe we're not, but most likely we are. Shana Swan, Dr. Swan just wrote a book in 2020. This is about infertility. That was the last thing on that list there. She has estimated in her book that there's a 52% decrease in male fertility since 1973 to 2011. She has said that if you straight line that, and it is a straight line right now, that the Western world will be functionally infertile by 2045. So unfortunately, in addition to all the other problems that we're worried about, we have infertility to worry about now. And a lot of that is potentially coming from plastic. At the bottom of the screen of that slide is a webinar, and you can just either if you do a print screen really quick, or we can send this out to you. There are webinars that Shana Swan has done. There's a couple online. There's a short one and a long one. I would encourage you to watch those. And then if you really want as well, you can buy the book in the local bookstore. This is really, really important information. Now, again, with everything, this is not simply, you can't blame plastics for all of that decrease. There's a lot of reasons for declining fertility. There's genetics, there's the environment in general, there's lifestyle factors are hugely important, but chemical exposures are really important because chemicals found in plastics called EDCs, endocrine disrupting chemicals, are directly implicated through animal studies in issues with fertility and morphological changes and hormonal changes. So, and this is not necessarily new science. This science has been around since, I can remember, since 1980s. So this is old science that's really just finally getting talked about, in a meaningful way. And it's really important. And some of the endocrine disrupting chemicals, just two of them found in plastics, are phthalates and bisphenols. PFAS is another one we'll come to. It's not found particularly necessarily in plastics. And pesticides, obviously, that's not a plastic issue. So phthalates, I'm just going to mention briefly that one class of chemicals. It's found in a lot of different plastics. The reason the rubber ducky is there because it's found a lot in children's toys. Now, phthalates, this is a study that just came out in the last couple of weeks, and it tied phthalates to mortality, so death rates in the United States. And what they found was that they identified between 90 and 107,000 attributable deaths to phthalates. And they put a cost of that, of those deaths at 40 to almost $50 billion in lost productivity. So again, this is a cost that we're bearing, that society's bearing, and we in Bermuda are bearing. So plastic is not quite as cheap as it seems, unfortunately. This is bisphenol. This is another chemical that's found, and you'll see a lot of times you'll see things that say BPA, so that's bisphenol A. That's a chemical that's been removed from a lot of plastics, bisphenol A, but they've just substituted it now with bisphenol S. It's implicated in a wide variety of diseases, and it's found in a lot of different things that you would never suspect, even receipts that you pick up with your hands, and it's absorbed through the skin. So the regulatory challenge, you might say, well, if these things are unsafe, why don't the government just eliminate them? Well, there's about 84,000 chemicals that are produced and released into the environment. Of those, about 1% have been tested for safety. More so in food contact, but not completely. So we can't just assume that government's going to protect you from chemical exposures, because usually it's after the fact, unfortunately. They might pick up some things before the fact, but assuming that, you know, the regulators are going to catch things before is a bad idea. That you're being exposed to all these chemicals without even really thinking about it, unfortunately. So, and that produces something called the cocktail effect. And that's not a good thing, unfortunately. It's not a good cocktail, because the way chemicals are tested, when they're tested, they test, say, a certain kind of phthalate, and they see what it does, say, to a fish or to a mouse, or maybe they'll test, you know, for degradation products in humans, you know, after the fact, and try to relate that to how much phthalates those people have, say, ingested. But they test one chemical at a time. But unfortunately, you're not being exposed to just one chemical at a time. You're being exposed to dozens of chemicals probably right now that you're not even aware of. And those things are actually additive. So just like a cocktail, one shot might not hurt you, but you add 3 shots of liquor in there, it suddenly has a big impact. And it's the same thing with chemical exposures. So I just want to talk about recycling, because I'm sure the question is going to come up, why don't we just recycle? And it's widely acknowledged now that we can't recycle our way out of the plastics crisis. There's just too much plastic in circulation. And of all the plastic ever produced, only 9% has ever been recycled. Most of it just winds up being either incinerated. I think the number there is about 12%. The rest of it just winds up in landfills. And there leaches chemicals, potentially leaches chemicals, or it gets burnt, possibly in open incineration systems where you're exposed to toxic gases. So recycling is really just a way of manufacturers trying to pass the cost on back to you again, because you have to pay the cost of recycling. Incineration is not a good solution for dealing with plastic, because unfortunately no incineration is perfect. It always has a residue in the form of ash, and it also releases certain toxic substances into the air. That's well documented. So incineration is not a perfect solution. It's a better solution probably than putting it into a landfill, yes, but we need to reduce the amount of plastic that goes into our landfills. So as you're aware, governments talked about reducing single-use items in Bermuda. So about 50% is single-use, which is why we're focused on single-use. The local environmental organizations have been talking about this for a long time. Government released a discussion paper recently, and they said they're going to start banning plastics beginning in this year, certainly next year. And as part of that, they have a government forum online now for your comments. So what are they going to ban? They're going to ban styrofoam products. They're going to ban plastic utensils, plastic bags, plastic trays, plastic water bottles, plastic single serving sachets, plastic lined paper cups, plastic products containing microplastics, and cotton buds, oxydegradable plastics. So that's those plastics that kind of crumble in your hand after a while. and so-called biodegradable plastics. So what can you do? There is something you can do. That's the good news. You can reduce your use of single-use plastic. It might take a little work, might take a little practice, but you can do it. We want reduction to be consumer-driven first, before legislation comes in. We're going to help with public education. It's going to take public education to get people to understand this. This is why we're doing these webinars. But we all have to also work to come up with solutions. We can't just talk about why we can't give up our plastic water bottle. We have to think, what can we do to avoid that plastic water bottle or plastic food tray or whatever it is? We have to come up with solutions. This will require a lot of planning and coordination to make sure it's done properly, and hopefully government's going to do that. The good news is that we're not alone. The world is acting on plastic. So what can you do? First of all, you just say no. If something comes in plastic, please just try to refuse it if you can. You can also replace those plastic items with other items. You see bamboo cutlery and stainless steel containers rather than plastic containers, cardboard containers. Rather than using plastic wrap, use bees wrap, reusable bags you're familiar with, and use a coffee cup. Use a real coffee cup rather than a plastic cup, because even those paper cups are lined with plastic. And also tell people what you're doing. It's important to spread the word. And don't worry, you don't need to be perfect. Nobody can be perfect. It's very hard to avoid plastic. We need, a handful of people doing plastic reduction or zero waste. We need it being done, imperfectly is fine. Much better than just a handful of people doing it perfectly. So just do what you can to reduce your use of plastic, and that'll be great. As you do so, just be aware of greenwashing. So greenwashing is something where somebody sticks a label on it and says, it's environmentally friendly. Well, just because it says it is doesn't mean it is. So that cup there is lined with plastic. That plastic box, even though it says it's compostable, it's not compostable. It's only compostable in a special facility that we don't have in Bermuda. Same thing with that cutlery in that box there. So it does take a little bit of paying attention. So it can be confusing. We appreciate that. And if you ever have questions, we're here to help you. So you can always just send us your questions. Again, just anything that has a green label, just pay attention to actually what's really in that product. There's one more thing. Unfortunately, when people tried to avoid plastic, they went to these fiber containers, and fiber containers are great as long as they're uncoated, because they can be coated either with plastic or they can be coated with something called PFAS. And PFAS is another compound that is to be avoided. And this is on government's list. So when government does bring in the regulations, they will ban compostable containers that contain PFAS. More good news here. People are aware of this. 68% say it's affecting, the areas that they live. 92% are saying, it affects them and the environment. So they're aware that it's affecting them personally, not just the environment. And a large majority of people think government should do something about it. Well, the good news is government is doing something about this. So I think that we're on the road here. I think it's going to be successful in Bermuda as it's going to be successful in everywhere else. And that's a pretty robust study. It's got 850 people in it. It's not completely representative because there was a higher proportion of women. So it's not completely representative of Bermuda, but I think it's pretty fair to say it probably is a good sampling. There was another sampling just last week in the paper that said 83% support restricting single-use plastic. So, sorry I got a little over tonight. We are Beyond Plastic Bermuda. Please follow us on Facebook and Instagram. We're part of a small community. We can all be part of the solution here in Bermuda. It's easy to fix things in Bermuda, much easier than the rest of the world. So we can do this. The world is moving on this, so we're not alone in this, but we can still be a leader. So if you support government in this policy change to reduce single-use plastic, you'll be helping Bermuda to lead the world on this. So refuse, reuse, and replace plastic whenever you can. Thank you. I turn it back over to Katie.
Hi, everyone. Thank you